The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide. Well, welcome to The Divide podcast. We're here today, Drew and I, with Thomas Sheedy, who's president of Atheists for Liberty. Welcome to The Divide, Thomas.
Thank you so much for having me.
And as I said, he's president for Atheists for Liberty. And you can just say one or two things about your group real quick, maybe, Thomas, and then we'll put a question to you.
Sure. Well, firstly, I want to say again, thank you so much for having me on the program. My name is Thomas Sheedy, everybody. I'm the president of an organization called Atheists for Liberty. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that cares about free speech, free thinking, and freedom for all. We have five main principles that we care about, and we've existed publicly for nearly 2 years now, caring about enlightenment values and bridging the divide between godless people.
All right, very nice. And what we wanted to ask Thomas today was about two cultural phenomena, which Drew and I, and I think Thomas will agree as well, are real phenomena, which one is Christian nationalism and the other is wokeism. Two sort of movements, I guess you could say, in the country. And the question for Thomas is, which one do you think is a greater threat to America?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I think this is part of a discussion I think more free-thinking atheists need to have. The simple answer is that I do think wokeism is a greater threat. Wokeism, I would just define in a very casual sense, as a critically social justice, or some would say postmodern view of the world that's originated mostly on college campuses, got very popularized over the past 5 to 10 years, that has basically made the claim that Western civilization in and of itself is bigoted, that has created a culture of systemic racism, issues of bigotry that normal types of liberal thinkers can't seem to understand, and that massive amounts of reparations and re-education needs to be implemented all throughout the private and public sectors of Western life and American life in order to readjust society to fit justice for oppressed different peoples and minority groups. Christian nationalism is also a problem. And I would define Christian nationalism basically as a politically theocratic force or initiative to bring personal religious belief into secular government to make it the law of the land.
Okay. So I think there's, I'm going to have a real easy time, actually, I think, Thomas, asking you about wokeism and explaining to you why, as a Christian, it's part of the problem with wokeism is that it's non-Christian, like that's, I'm going to argue that that's part of the problem. But then of course, Drew's going to flank me and then he's going to say, yeah, but you see, Bill, Christianity has created this whole Christian nationalist phenomenon, which is also a problem. So let me just ask you about the sort of postmodern nature of wokeism, as you were talking about. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of Christians will say, there's the root of the problem, that you have this rising secular movement, which has become unanchored, unmoored from a basic absolute sense of values, absolute morality. Mm-hmm. And so it's been fishing around for something, and it's found something else to replace it, and it's absolutizing what is otherwise a relative moral value system. So I think a lot of Christians would say that's the biggest problem with that. So what's your sort of response to that?
So my response, and I have responded to this a few times on other programs, there has been this view, especially even amongst some in the conservative movement, that new atheism and the secular atheist movement and this sort of sweeping away of religion being the number one focus point in people's lives in the West is the reason as to wokeism has swept everything. And I would actually disagree with that, because if you look at the atheist movement before Atheism Plus succeeded in 2016, things were organized, things were professional. Wokeism was not the driving force behind the atheist movement. The reason why wokeism took over organized atheism was because of a cluster of administrative decisions and Trojan horses, individual decisions that ended up making it possible for this ideology to creep in and to destroy the movement. But there was a very long period of time where wokeism was not present in the atheist community. And not only that, a lot of people could make the argument that wokeism is very similar to religion in of itself. And that's why also you have plenty of new atheist types such as Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, Michael Shermer, and numerous others, Heather McDonald, who are, and Melissa Chen, who are standing up to this corrosive and divisive belief system.
What would, just to put it a little bit differently, the way I would sort of see that is that I can't remember if I've shared this story before, but it's a true story from when I worked at this office, and the parking lot was this really weird sort of circular. But it was not a perfect circle kind of parking lot. It's not an easy place to organize the parking spaces, and they repaved it. So all these people were used to parking in their spots, and then they repaved it, but they didn't paint the lines right away.
No.
And so for about 3 days, everybody parked sort of where they were supposed to. Like everybody had their spots, and then 1 or 2 people decided, hey, they haven't painted the lines, so we can kind of just park wherever. Or maybe there was somebody new visiting or something, they parked wherever, and that kind of started to cause one part of the parking lot to become a mess. And then after a few more days, the whole thing just became sort of chaos. And then they painted the lines and everybody went back. So my sort of view is that, is that for a while, the secular America was kind of like Elvis, if you want to pick one person, right? He's pretty much lives a secular life, but he still sings the hymns in his concerts. He still respects the Bible. And I think sort of historically, that's what's happened in the West is it's been living off the fumes of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then it just sort of ran out of gas, and people started realizing, hey, there aren't any lines, we can park where we want to. So how do you think that's not a factor at all?
I think it is somewhat a factor. If you just look at simple Pew Research, right, you're able to see the decline in religious affiliation fairly easily. So I would say it's fairly accurate. I would just claim that it's not entirely a negative. That since 3 days later, right, those new lines were painted. We as a culture, I think, are in the process of trying to figure out when those new lines are going to be painted. But we want those new lines. We want that parking lot to be nice and clean and orderly, where people are able to park properly. We're just going to try to hire a different company this time to paint those lines. But we want the lines because we're seeing we're seeing the problems right now where there are no lines being painted, where we're dealing with a lot of alternatives to religious belief that are just as toxic, that many us atheists would argue is just as toxic as religious belief. And we're seeing the disorder, we're seeing the mayhem. We do want order, we do want a respect for society, a respect for values, but we're changing companies this time. We're not sticking with the same old model.
And I would piggyback on that to sort of question the premise that wokeism came out of atheism. The way Thomas describes it, it's sort of the opposite. It kind of seeped its way in to atheism, and I don't know that it's a necessarily atheist. I think you could be a woke Christian if you were liberal enough. Maybe I'm not willing to die on that hill, but that's just the way it seems to me. Just sort of thinking off the cuff there.
I actually would love to chime in actually just for a moment to actually also defend the non-woke and anti-woke Christians out there for a second. I have a great relationship with a gentleman by the name of Michael O'Fallon. He runs an organization called Sovereign Nations. I believe it's out in Florida. And one of the activist things that he's doing, very similar to how we at Atheists for Liberty are trying to push back against wokeism and atheism, is he's trying to push back against wokeism and Christianity. Wokeism is now seeping into Christian churches, Catholic churches, Baptist churches, everywhere. And so O'Fallon what he ended up strategically doing is he said, okay, I'm going to contact the anti-woke atheists. I'm going to build up sovereign nations to push back against wokeism and Christianity. I'm going to contact James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, and we're going to form this sort of coalition of people to push back against wokeism in all of our institutions. So not only has wokeism crept into atheism in and of itself, but now Christianity in 2021 is facing the same exact problem too.
Yeah, just to add to that, there are churches, some famous churches in America with at least famous pastors or former pastors, where they've split, or they're undergoing splits, or they're having divisive issues. I think it's the David Platt's church in Virginia has some sort of issues regarding some of this, and I think there's been some in the John Piper's old church. And I'm not really, I can't say, to be clear, that they're textbook examples of what you're saying. I just know that you're absolutely right, that within the Christian evangelical, say, world, defined very broadly, not just one denomination, that there's a lot of divisiveness on the horizon, or maybe not on the horizon, but already in churches. I think you're right about that. And it's probably because wokeism is fundamentally has a strong moral fuel or impetus to it. So anytime you get into issues of racism or whatever, you immediately get, it's easy to get Christians on board in one sense, that Christians have, the Christian view of humanity is we're fallen and the injustice is rampant. And it's not just racial, it's between the sexes, it's between your in-laws and you, or whatever. I mean, like, there's problems, between humans constantly. And so I suppose that's one of the reasons why that's the case. But so, yeah, I think you're right. I think there's sort of, just from my perspective, there's a war sort of brewing within the Christian world over these issues as well. How would you, how, in a sense, you've sort of set yourself up as the new company, let's just put it that way, or at least whom to hire. I don't know, you're the general contractor. And so doesn't that, just put you out as just someone who claims to have yet another religion to solve the problem the right way? How does that make you, how are you different?
I guess we are different in that we are, at the moment, Atheists for Liberty is one of the very few organizations in the United States that is still seeking to push forward the agenda and the talking points of the new atheists. You could see, in American secularism, at least, the vast majority of organizations domestically here at home pushing a completely different agenda. People such as Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris being completely shunned by what is remain to be 501c3 and 501c4 multi-million-dollar organizations that once platformed and respected these individuals. So the plan was already there to retain religious liberty in the United States in a new secular age, but it was cut short due to wokeism. But Atheists for Liberty, all we exist for is to continue that plan and to maybe make some improvements along the way.
Is Atheists for Liberty just another sort of Atheist Plus, in the sense that, like, in other words, what would the thing be that's not the plus? Because it's obviously, I don't know, what would you call it? Classical liberalism, American classical liberalism?
You could call it that, or you could call it atheism minus. Maybe that sums us up pretty well. I used to run a local American atheist affiliate on Long Island. I used to run a local atheist group. And one of the things I really wanted to do when I was president, I was at the Second Reason rally just a few months before I became president of that organization. I saw new atheism basically die that day. I saw wokeism basically creep up to the highest echelons of power in Washington, D.C. And I knew that when I took over this organization and to just try to think as to how we're going to move from here, I'm going to at least do my best to make sure that this atheist group would remain neutral, not on the pro-woke side, not on the anti-woke side. But the more that I did that, I started to notice wokeism even creeping in more and more into what remained of anything sane and normal in the atheist community. Mythicist Milwaukee, my good friends at Myth Informed, being blatantly attacked and harassed numerously online and in person for daring to have shoe on head and armored skeptic at their conventions. Rationality Rules being attacked by the atheist community of Austin for daring to make a video questioning transgender sports. American Atheists, sadly, the former organization that I looked up to so much, platforming a article, a Huffington Post piece, attacking Bill Maher, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris for somehow their influence being linked to the Christchurch shooting, I believe in New Zealand or Australia. The movement completely died. And what I wanted to do when I led this local group is I wanted it to remain completely neutral. But the more I stayed out of the fight, I realized that there was nothing left to keep. And so I realized a few years later that there had to be a force in the atheist movement to push back against what happened to the atheist community. That atheism isn't going anywhere. Pew research is still showing that more and more people are becoming atheists. So what do we want? Do we want more and more people becoming atheists with a woke atheist community that's going to divide people and hurt people more and make society not good for anybody in control of that growth? Or do we want more normal, sane people that are willing to bridge divides, like how things used to be in the atheist community, be in charge of navigating that growth towards a positive direction in American public policy? And I go with the latter solution. And so we are atheism minus. We are involved in mentioning wokeism, even though it doesn't strictly always relate to atheism, because we see wokeness as the one thing that's going to make atheism fail or make organized atheism fail. So in that sense, we're atheism minus. In that sense, we are bringing some outside politics involved. But the difference is we acknowledge it from the very beginning. We're not hiding under supposed neutrality like a lot of these other organizations are. And we're very clear as to where we stand and where we don't stand.
So maybe even atheism plus minus, right? It's it's sort of a, and to that extent, you can see that the atheist for liberty, the for liberty, is a pushback against sort of the wokeism side.
Yeah.
Is there, sort of to continue to riff on Bill's question, is there what is the atheism part of that is important to you, as opposed to just being for liberty? Like, in other words, you wouldn't align. Are you also, do you have a side that's pushing back against wokeism and a side that's pushing back against Christianity or religion in general?
Yes, we do have that. And one of the things I wanted to state from the very get-go when forming Atheists for Liberty, I told my supporters and I told the people that were helping to form this organization, is that there are so many anti-woke organizations that exist in the liberty movement and in the conservative movement and in plenty of other places. But the problem is that there were also plenty of atheists that were leaving the atheist movement, rightfully so, and going to these communities because they were much more saner. But some of them were softening their position on Christianity or softening their atheism. Some of them even blatantly hiding their atheism. And I found that to be a very damaging thing for the future of atheist civil rights in the United States. If we're conceding and not even acknowledging that we're godless people and that we're atheists and we're pretending to be Christians, that's not only disrespectful to believing Christians, but it doesn't help atheist civil rights at all. And so, yes, we are an anti-woke organization, but we are also an atheist organization. We care about secular government still. We care about normalizing atheism. Yes, we have a bunch of other things that we're doing, and yes, we'll even team up with some religious people on certain issues, especially the combating wokeism part. But I wanted to make sure from the very get-go that we're not forgetting who we are. We're not only in favor of liberty, we're not only anti-woke, we are atheists for liberty. That's what makes us different. That's what made us fill that white space when we premiered at CPAC nearly 2 years ago.
Since it's really American liberty in the more, probably in practical terms, you're talking about American liberty, right? Because you're an American organization. So in a way, are you sort of a halfway house on the way out to theism for some atheists in this sense, like a Dave Rubin type person who was formerly atheist and is certainly a classical liberal, but used to be far more a creature of the left. But he moved into classical liberalism first, and then he's moved into sort of theism because the American tradition is so, like the Declaration of Independence is a blatant statement about our unique American qualities being rooted in belief in God at some level. God's given the rights, or Creator's given the rights from Jefferson's hand. So do you feel like your set of beliefs they obviously sit very nicely on a kind of Jeffersonian deism, at least, and they sit decently enough in Christianity traditionally. So what's your response to that?
It sits decently enough, I would say, in the realm of diplomacy. We are in a very nice position where I would say we're not even deist, and I don't think we're a home for people that are going to be leaving atheism anytime soon, but we are a home for people who are willing to still operate in the pre-postmodern world that I guess we had in the 2000s and for a good chunk of the 2010s, right? So if you're a militant atheist or a firebrand like former American atheist President David Silverman, who has just become anti-woke, you can come on board. If you're a little more diplomatic in your tone, you can come on board. You're a centrist, classical liberal, or a libertarian or conservative, or whatever, but you want to still see American secularism thrive and not focus on a million different genders or systemic racism anywhere, you can come on board. If you're a religious individual, but you see a project that can get the fastest growing religious demographic by a factor of 10, on board with what you're trying to promote, Atheists for Liberty could be a home for you as well. So we were able to strategically position ourselves to where, unlike the atheist movement now, we can continue to move forward in quite a large avenue of things, without facing much pushback from any potential allies. The only people that really don't like us are woke people, Islamists, and you could argue some Christian nationalists as well.
When you mentioned Christians that sort of share, some of your ideas, especially about wokeism, I thought you were going to say, those would be candidates to partner with, or to do, to come alongside your organization. But you actually, I don't remember your exact word, but I think you said those would be candidates or potential people to join your cause, which is, to me, was
I
a
think
little.
you framed it a little better.
Okay, I get it. I
Yeah.
get it. Yeah, no,
But
I mean,
they are our allies. They are allies.
I think it might be an interesting pivot, if everyone else wants to go this way, to sort of talk about the differences you would have with, I mean, obviously Christian nationalists, but the sort of more, maybe even moderate traditional Christians who would be for liberty, but certainly not for atheism.
Right. So we do have some blatant differences there, even with some of our Christian allies. Number one, we'll state the obvious: we don't believe in God. They do. Number two, we are far more open about our want for secular government. There are some milquetoast Christians that would still be, I guess, okay with some of the talking points of the old religious right of the day, but I think a lot of them have also realized that those days are no longer there. And if we are to fight for simply a common, continuing a common language without changing the definitions a million times, English common law, civil rights, discourse and freedom of speech and expression, due process, and not getting your reputation canned because a bunch of crazies went after you on Twitter. I think the argument that I've seen many anti-woke Christians who were friendly to us come up to us and say is that we have a much larger fight on our hands. And that is something that we absolutely agree with them on. And the other thing too, I love it when we get attacked by the woke atheists on this. They will gladly work with progressive or woke Christians. They'll gladly go after me in the comments of Facebook threads saying, Thomas, I will never, ever, ever work with a conservative atheist. I would rather work with a progressive LGBTQIA++ AIABC Black Lives Matter type Christian or theist any day. Then why can't we do it? Why can't we do it? So it's, I love how they do that little thing where they blame us for working with conservative theists, but they get to do the opposite and face no criticism. So those are my differences, I would say, with some of our Christian allies. Sort of the typical culture war 1.0 disagreements. But then there are, of course, some blatant disagreements that we have with the Christian nationalists. what we would define as who we would define as Christian nationalists, so much so that they are not our allies, they're our enemies.
Because it seems sort of obvious to me that Christianity was never intended, certainly not in the ministry of Jesus. However seriously you take the accuracy of the Gospels, the early Christian communities, the apostles and so on, was not a political movement.
Mhm.
Didn't view itself as trying to take over Rome, even though Rome did become a kind of quasi-Christian government. The real Christian governments came, like the marriage of church and state came much, much later. And even that, most Christians since the Reformation have not viewed positively. Luther and Calvin were the ones who wrote, sort of for the Christian community, the treatises advocating for the separation of church and state long before you ever got to 1776. So it's, for me as a Christian, I think of Christian nationalism as sort of obviously bad for Christianity, that it confuses what Christianity is. And I also don't think of the American government or the American system, I guess, as being separable from Christianity in terms of its sort of roots. It was a predominantly Christian world, Christian value system, the way Christians, the Christian worldview, the Constitution generally sat well with that Christian worldview, and came out of a kind of Christian / Enlightenment or whatever tradition. So I don't really I see Christian nationalism for me as first a threat to Christianity, of what Christianity really is. But then I also see it as, I don't really think about it a lot in terms of just America, but I certainly think of it as bad for the American system as well. Free exercise of religion. When you read Jefferson's original letter in which he used the expression, the wall of separation, I think most Christians would read that letter and say, yes, I agree with what Jefferson meant here. I'm not sure.
Well,
I go ahead.
The way you're framing it, I feel like I need to interrupt, because I feel like you're saying, oh, that's just a bunch of fringes. It's not really ubiquitous among Christianity. And if that's the case, then why are we talking about it? Maybe it doesn't make it sound like much of a problem. I think the interesting case is where the lines get blurred, and people, in an attempt to vote their conscience, are sort of pulled in the direction of a monolithic Christian, voting bloc, for lack of a better words, that maybe isn't Christian nationalism full stop, but it can be maybe not in the best interest of everyone. I mean, do you have any pushback against that characterization? Because
No, I really don't. I think of wokeism and Christian nationalism as two things where basically very few people want to actually identify as either of those two things, right? What you really have is a spectrum of ideas that some people are deeper in than others. And I think that's true of both Christian nationalism and of wokeism. And there's a sort of harmless or a lot less deleterious forms of both, So I think there's a spectrum of both. And I hear it on the Christian side. I certainly hear people say things that I find not Christian, who are Christians, but they've married their Christianity to patriotism and stuff. But I think of it as a fairly light version of it, just like I hear some people talk about social justice in ways that it's a fairly light version of it, so.
I think the idea of the spectrum is good, because I think, just as wokeism kind of brings people into its orbit that wouldn't describe themselves as particularly educated nor concerned about intersectionality within all this stuff, or really even informed about it, and yet they feel like good people, and so they hear the case that, oh, we need to do this or that for any, however you want to define any particular minority or perceived minority. They think, well, I'm a good person. I think I want to take care of people in general. I want to help people have an easier time that are having a hard time, and blah blah blah, and then you get this sort of pull into that, and then the end of the spectrum starts to bleed into the moderate middle, and, and on the other side you have this. Not many Christians that I know would call themselves Christian nationalists, and yet it bleeds into the moderates because you start hearing people that know nothing. They couldn't tell you how many judges are on the Supreme Court will start talking about, well, we've got to get this, judge appointed, so we've got to vote for this guy so that he'll appoint this judge so that you know abortion is illegal again or something.
I think that sort of happens on all sides regardless, because everybody has a set of values that they're trying to advocate for. Whether they're religious or non-religious really is irrelevant, in the sense that there's going to be a set of values they advocate for, and they want sort of people in office, leaders who sort of advocate for those values. Where I think all of probably the three of us are going to feel much more comfortable with one another is that we're all probably very comfortable with the constitutional structure that defines what the limits on those values are, what the reach of those values are. You're not really going to be threatened by my Christian value system that much, so long as the leaders I'm supporting are wanting to operate within the constitutional structure as written. That's my guess, is that, in other words, the Constitution protects both of us, right, against one another, is the idea. Yeah. And that's probably the way we both view it, is it has a limitation on what either of us could do given our value system.
This goes back to my spectrum idea, is that there are people on both ends that are saying, screw the Constitution, let's get this, let's go extreme to this point of view, or let's go extreme to this point of view. And the ones that are winning may be the most problematic.
Do you really like, is it your impression, just take the Christian nationalist side? I would say we hear a lot more on the woke side of people, or on the cultural left, which I'll equate with wokeism, which probably isn't fair, but just for the conversation, you hear a lot more like, let's like the Constitution is fundamentally flawed and needs to be completely overhauled or displaced or replaced, than I think you hear from the Christian nationalist side. Like, I wouldn't think there's a large percentage of Christians who are advocating for dumping the Constitution.
But to flesh out the other side of the spectrum, I would say it's not necessarily dump the Constitution. It's let's use, put our values into place with laws that maybe not dump the Constitution, but infringe on the separation of church and state to some extent. That's the key point from the other side. And maybe it's a milder thing, and maybe it's also a less attractive thing. I'll let Thomas talk, because I think this is what he was saying. Is that one side it has more power in the current moment. I almost feel like the Christian nationalist side has lost some ground.
Yeah, I would argue that I think what we used to consider to be the Christian nationalist side 10 years ago has lost a lot of ground, right? So the old religious right moral majority that encompassed the silent generation, baby boomer generation, and bits of Generation X, that their power is dying off. And I would argue that's just due to American secularism and the rise of atheists just rising more and more and more. The fact that we live in a more secular age. The old culture war of a few years ago with the atheist movement, I think, really took care of that on the most part. Now we're dealing with wokeism, which has taken control of pretty much most of American public and private life outside of the U.S. government. Even you could argue bits of the government now, pushing its agenda, and it seems to not be dying at any point. Whereas with what we used to consider to be Christian nationalism, it's now dead. I would argue, though, that there is a new Christian nationalism that's actually brewing, and this is a Christian nationalism that what remains of the atheist movement doesn't even care about. The people that are in charge of the atheist community now, they are basically in their positions to just push what I would argue a social justice, woke political agenda. So they don't want to see anything positive that could happen for secularism or atheism on the political right, even though it would advance the original mission of so many of these organizations to advance atheist civil rights and to push for a separation between religion and government, etc. But being in the conservative movement, for instance, I see a rising threat coming from the far, 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 far right that is brewing now. I'm 23. I just graduated from college half a year ago. And around 2 years ago, I ended up, I was a part of Turning Point USA chapters and college Republican chapters. And I ended up witnessing something called the Groyper Wars. I don't know if you two have heard of this phenomenon called the Groyper Wars. So among
It
my
sounds like a
generation,
really big fish.
it's
Sounds like a B movie or something.
so Groypers are at least the reason why the name exists is because of it describes sort of an alt-rightish Pepe the Frog kind of meme. So it is kind of amphibian in nature. Um, So I think we can all agree with the premise that because kind of what I explained a few minutes ago, that because atheism and the atheist movement, there were a lot of victories when the atheist movement was healthy and alive. It has made religiosity less potent, even on the political right. I think this is something we can generally kind of agree with. Um, because of this, there are certain forces that were on the extreme right that saw that phenomenon and they said, "Whoa, we got to do something about that." There's a kid who's my age. His name is Nick Fuentes. He lives in Illinois. He hosts a show called America First. And in 2017, when he was around 18 years old, he was present at the Charlottesville, Virginia alt-right, you could argue extreme far-right rally and event. He saw the problems that happened in Charlottesville, the bad optics of his own side, some of his fellow extremists wearing neo-Nazi uniforms and David Duke being present there, and some people literally wearing Ku Klux Klan attire at this event. And even though he believes in a good chunk of, you could argue, white nationalist and other agendas in that category, he saw the need to rebrand. And what he ended up doing is on this show, America First, he ended up linking this sort of white nationalism with Christianity and basically saying that this kind of stuff, we need to get these ideas and make them more mainstream within American conservatism. And the claim that he has made when building up his audience over the last 4 to 5 years is that the conservative movement has become too secular. The conservative movement is becoming too gay friendly, too homosexual friendly, too atheist friendly, and it's becoming degenerate. It's becoming not conservative anymore. And what he ended up doing is he ended up going to having a lot of his supporters go to Charlie Kirk Turning Point USA college tours, Ben Shapiro college tours, Stephen Crowder college tours, and raiding the Q&A lines of these massive college tours that were being streamed to the general public on YouTube and other platforms, saying, why do you guys support homosexuality? Why do you guys support secularism and anal sex? I kid you not. Like I was viewing this stuff live as it was happening. And what he was able to do is through his optics of, I guess, this kind of loudness and comedic way of doing things, his movement was able to explode. And there's a current infiltration process that's happening on the right where you have these real Christian nationalists that actually want Catholic monarchism to become the new law of the land because they think the Constitution is gay. They think the Constitution is made up by and that the founding fathers were crazy and weird, and that we need to go back to the old traditions of old Europe. They want to transform conservatism and transform all of America into a literal theocratic or theistic state.
I would guess there's always been some minority of people who have thought things like this, right? I mean,
Yes,
wouldn't you think that's pretty much been around since
that's always, they've
17?
always existed, but the difference is, and this is something that people really need to pay attention to now, is that their movement, while it is still fringe, it is growing more and more. And what they are doing is they're presenting themselves as normal conservatives and normal Donald Trump supporters wearing MAGA hats, and they're infiltrating the Heritage Foundation. They're trying to infiltrate the Heritage Foundation. They're trying to infiltrate Turning Point USA. They're trying to infiltrate Young Americans for Liberty and Young America's Foundation, CPAC, the GOP infrastructure. And that what they're trying to do is they're trying to slowly drag them further and further right and make it more further and further and further religion only. which is going to damage the reputation of our Christian allies, and it's going to damage all the work that is being done to normalize atheism and normalize secularism and normalize a joint fight also against wokeism on the far left. And this is another problem. This is the real Christian nationalism, but you won't see what remains of the atheist movement talking about that, because if they dare get involved in that fight, they're daring to defend the good people on the right who could be potential allies for secularism.
That's
So
interesting.
they're calling Christian nationalists just all conservatives and all libertarians. They're calling those people Christian nationalists as if 2021 is 2011 or 2001. And they're ignoring the real impending Christian nationalist threat that could kill the conservative movement, as far as we know.
That's interesting, because it does sound somewhat fringe still, as you said, and though it's growing, it's the kind of thing that I would be tempted to, almost ignore and think, well, that can never, that doesn't have enough draw for the.
Mm-hmm.
However, I can see how it's the exact opposite of wokeism, whereas it's basically wokeism is saying you are not compassionate enough, and this movement you were just talking about is saying you're not conservative enough, you're not Christian enough, you don't care enough, you're a carnal Christian and a wishy-washy conservative. And so there's these two sides of it's interesting that I see wokeism way more taking off, because
wokeism
I think the argument that you're not compassionate enough stirs a person a little bit more, especially in a culture that's already getting away from traditions, conservative, religion, just that there's already a trend sort of at the back of wokeism, and maybe even away from what you were just describing. Although I will say you've partially convinced me to watch out for it, because it does seem like I've seen threads of that in other movements, as you talked about.
And 2 years ago, when these wars started happening, I never thought, I was at SUNY Albany at the time. I thought, and I was having conversations with the college Republican president at the time, with the people in the Turning Point USA chapter that we had at the time, and we were just a random college in upstate New York. And I said, okay, I'm seeing this happening. This is a big, big, giant threat. I have to warn you all about this, but we can take a rest a little bit, because this isn't going to happen to our chapter. And then we ended up finding out later on that one of this leader's head, they called them Groiper generals, was in our chapter as one of our Turning Point chapter's vice presidents, who actually was someone who I considered to be a friend, and who I was inviting to my apartment twice a week to have parties with the chapter. And he was there as sort of
infiltrated
the entire time at a random SUNY institution in upstate New York. And not only that, I have started to see, and I still respect plenty of the organizations in the conservative movement, the branding is slowly changing. They are slowly doing some effective work. For instance, I like Turning Point USA. I think Turning Point USA is a great organization in terms of when it comes to pushing back against wokeness on college campuses. They have the most amount of money. They have the most amount of resources. They have so much infrastructure where they could really, even if you disagree with some of their, Trumpy conservatism stuff, they're a great institution when it comes to pushing back against wokeness. Well, I would argue that because of this infiltration against the conservative movement from the far, far right, they recently launched a new initiative less than a year ago called Turning Point Faith. Turning Point Faith. Turning Point, for a long time, presented itself as, we're the cool, classical, liberal, libertarian types. It was seen as like the partying, kind of fun right-wingers, open-minded and tolerant. And in many ways, they still are. I like Charlie Kirk in many ways. Don't get me wrong, even though he's, we have some theological differences, but there has been a slow decline, where even though we are winning, and even though the right is becoming more secular, and even though everything that Justin has probably told you all in the last appearances is still completely true, by the way, there are some consequences that we're seeing of this new Christian nationalism that the remnants of atheism are simply not paying attention to.
I'm not really involved in any of the political like organizations or anything like that. I'm not really I'm not a registered anything, you know.
Mhm.
Not that I don't have opinions about it, but I'm just saying I'm not really sort of a partisan.
Right.
And I think I would say there's probably within Christianity a much more of an influence from the woke side than the far right side. But I
Yes.
do think you're right. I do see things like this. I just hear people say stuff, and I'm just thinking, this seems also wacko to me, you know. But I think chaos more than anything seems like it's ruling the day. But I find for myself, I'm really trying to, most of the time, what matters to me, and I think the way I would describe most of my Christian friends, and not that this is just anecdotal, but it's all I can describe in my experience, is most people, I think, are much more interested in sort of Christianity and its essential features. And, you know, as much as our discussions here are much more sort of political cultural today, I'm my own personal interest is more on, you know, what do you think about God? Why do you think this? How did you come to your beliefs? And where things settle out politically, as I'm guessing we, again, probably the three of us are able to live happily together in a pluralistic society, knowing that as long as the Constitution sort of generally holds, and there's room for amendments to the Constitution, you know, if that becomes a dominant thing. But I think you're right. There's a lot of forces pulling on Christians, just as there are pulling on people on the secular side of things. And there's a massive amount of anxiety and tension in people's own sort of emotional psyche, their emotional intelligence, and who really knows where all that's headed? I think there's much bigger discussions to be had other than just wokeism versus Christian nationalism and so on. But we could go on and on. I sort of sense we're probably at a good closing point. Really appreciated having you on today, Thomas. Appreciate you just giving us your take on sort of what's going on in sort of the larger atheist movement and how you see wokeism versus Christian nationalism and so on. Just thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Once again, really do want to express my appreciation for having me on the show. You guys can everybody who's listening, you can find out more about what we do at atheistsforliberty.org. If you're interested in signing up and becoming a member, membership is $1 a month, $12 a year, and we're a 501c3 organization. All contributions are tax deductible. You can give as much as you can for the holidays, and we really do appreciate any and all support that people can show to us. We are in a gigantic culture war right now, and we need all hands on deck. Regardless of your view, if you land somewhere in where Drew and William stand, you are a prime candidate to team up with us and to help us fight for our mission of free speech, free thinking, and freedom for all. And we're at a precipice of massive change in the country and in the world right now. And so we need everybody to get involved in the fight as much as they possibly can. So I really appreciate getting to talk and clarify where we stand in this in this two-front conflict here. And so once again, William, Drew, thank you so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it.
All right, very nice. I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.